In the rural Nova Scotia summer of 1988, social workers knocked on a door they would never forget. What they discovered inside was more than just neglect. It was more than just poverty. It was something older. Something that, for generations, had been happening in the dark corners of that mountain. The children couldn't read. They couldn't write their own names. Some of them didn't even know what year it was. And when investigators began asking questions, they realized the truth was far worse than anything for which they had prepared. This is the story of the Goler Clan, a family that lived outside society's rules, outside the law, and in some ways, outside of time itself. What happened on that mountain was more than a tragedy. It was a system. And the people who built that system made sure no one would ever talk about it. Hello everyone. Before we begin, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The name Goler doesn't appear in many history books. You won't find monuments or memorials. But in the Nova Scotia backwoods, near a place called White Rock, the name carried weight. It carried fear. For decades, the Goler family lived in isolation on South Mountain, a stretch of wilderness. So remote that even locals rarely ventured there. They had no running water, no electricity, no contact with the outside world unless they needed it. To outsiders, they were just another poor rural family trying to survive. But inside that community, behind the trees and the silence, something else was happening. Something passed down like a dark inheritance. The children born into the Goler clan weren't just isolated from society. They were trapped inside a nightmare that most people couldn't even imagine. And in 1988, that nightmare finally came to light. The call came in from a school. A teacher had noticed something wrong with one of the children. Not just that the child was struggling academically, though that was part of it. It was the way the child flinched when touched. The way they couldn't answer basic questions about their home life. The way they seemed to exist in a fog, disconnected from reality, in a way that went beyond simple neglect. When social workers arrived at the Goler property, they weren't prepared for what they were walking into. The homes, if you could call them that, were little more than shacks scattered across the mountainside. Some had no doors, no windows. Inside, the smell was overwhelming. Garbage piled in corners, no beds, just mattresses on floors covered in stains. But it wasn't the poverty that stopped them cold. It was the children. There were dozens of them, some as young as 2 years old, others in their teens. They were dirty, malnourished, and many of them had never seen a doctor in their lives. But what disturbed the investigators most was how the children behaved around the adults. There was a strange familiarity, a closeness that didn't feel right. The children didn't ask questions. They didn't cry for their parents when they were separated. It was as if they had been trained not to react, trained not to feel. When authorities started interviewing the children, the stories that emerged were almost impossible to believe. Not because they seemed exaggerated, but because they were so consistent, so detailed. So matter of fact, the children described abuse that had been happening for as long as they could remember. Abuse that involved not just their parents, but their uncles, their cousins, their grandparents. It wasn't random. It wasn't opportunistic. It was organized. It was expected. It was normal. As investigators dug deeper, they realized they weren't dealing with a single case of abuse. They were dealing with a culture, a way of life that had been passed down through generations of the Goler family. The mountain had been their kingdom. And inside that kingdom, the rules of the outside world didn't apply. Children were property. Boundaries didn't exist. And anyone who might have spoken up had been silenced long before they ever got the chance. The more the authorities learned, the more they understood that what happened on South Mountain wasn't just a crime. It was a system that had been protected by isolation, by poverty, by the indifference of a society that had decided these people weren't worth paying attention to. Until 1988, the Goler clan had operated in complete darkness. And now, for the first time, someone was shining a light. To understand what happened on South Mountain, you have to understand where it started. The Goler family traced their roots back to a man named Charles Goler who arrived in Nova Scotia sometime in the late 1800s. He settled in the backwoods, far from any town, far from any authority. He had children. Those children had children. And somewhere along the way, the family stopped reaching outward. They stopped marrying people from outside the clan. They turned inward. And when a family turns inward for long enough, something breaks. By the 1980s, the Goler family tree had become a tangled web that was almost impossible to map. Brothers married sisters, uncles fathered children with nieces. Cousins produced offspring who were also their siblings. The genetic consequences were visible in some of the children. Developmental delays, physical abnormalities, but the psychological consequences ran even deeper. In a family where everyone was related in multiple ways, where the same man could be your father and your uncle and your cousin all at once, the concept of boundaries ceased to exist. There was no clear line between parent and child, between protector and predator. The family had created its own reality, and inside that reality, the unthinkable became routine. The adults in the Goler clan had grown up in the same system. Many of them had been victims themselves as children. They had learned that this was simply how things were. They had no reference point for normal family relationships because they had never experienced them. Isolation had done its work perfectly. Cut off from schools, from churches, from neighbors who might have questioned what they saw. The Golers had become a world unto themselves. And in that world the strongest made the rules. The children were taught not to speak to outsiders. They were taught that the police were the enemy. They were taught that what happened in the family stayed in the family. Some of them didn't even know that what was happening to them was wrong. They had nothing to compare it to. When investigators finally pieced together the family tree, they found themselves looking at something that resembled a medical diagram more than a genealogy chart. The same names appeared over and over in different positions. A woman who was both mother and aunt to the same child. A man who had fathered children with his own daughter, creating offspring who were simultaneously his children and his grandchildren. It wasn't just incest. It was a complete collapse of family structure, a genetic and psychological catastrophe that had been building for generations. And at the center of it all were the children. Children who had never chosen this life, who had been born into a system designed to use them, to break them, to ensure they would never escape. When the children finally started talking, their words carried a weight that silenced entire courtrooms. These weren't dramatic confessions. They weren't crying or hysterical. They spoke in flat, emotionless voices, describing horrors as if they were reciting a grocery list. That's what made it so disturbing. The abuse had been so constant, so normalized that the children didn't even recognize it as extraordinary. They thought every family lived this way. They thought every child experienced what then they had experienced. One girl, barely 12 years old, testified that she couldn't remember a time when it hadn't been happening. She named her father, her uncles, her grandfather. She described specific incidents with the kind of detail that prosecutors knew couldn't be fabricated. She didn't cry when she spoke. She just stared straight ahead as if she were reading from a script she had memorized long ago. Another child, a boy of 14, told investigators about being forced to participate in acts he didn't have words for. He had never been to school. He had never learned that what was happening to him had a name, that it was illegal, that other families didn't live this way. When asked why he never told anyone, he looked confused. Tell who? There was no one to tell. Everyone in his world was part of the same system. The adults were either perpetrators or victims who had learned to stay silent. There were no teachers to confide in, no neighbors to run to, no escape route that didn't lead right back to the mountain. The testimony went on for weeks. Child after child took the stand, and each one told a version of the same story. The details varied, but the structure was always the same. The abuse had started when they were young, sometimes as young as 5 or 6 years old. It had been committed by multiple family members. It had happened regularly, often in full view of other adults who did nothing to stop it, and it had been accompanied by threats. If you tell, you'll be taken away. If you tell, something worse will happen. If you tell, no one will believe you anyway. The defense attorneys tried to poke holes in the testimony. They suggested the children had been coached by social workers. They argued that the stories were too similar, too rehearsed. But the prosecutors had an answer for that. The stories were similar because they were true. The children hadn't been coached. They had simply lived the same nightmare in the same place under the same system. The consistency wasn't evidence of fabrication. It was evidence of a pattern. A pattern that had been operating in plain sight for decades, hidden only by distance and by a society that had chosen not to look. And now that society was being forced to look, forced to confront the fact that this had been happening in their own backyard, in their own country, in their own time. The children's testimony wasn't just evidence in a trial. It was an indictment of everyone who had failed to see what was happening. Everyone who had driven past those shacks on the mountain and decided it wasn't their problem. In 1992, the trials began. 16 members of the Goler family were charged with more than 100 counts of sexual abuse, incest, and neglect. The courtroom in Kentville, Nova Scotia, became the stage for one of the most disturbing legal proceedings in Canadian history. The defendants sat together, some of them holding hands, some of them whispering to each other as if they still didn't understand what they had done wrong. They looked like any other rural family. Weathered faces, worn clothing, eyes that seemed perpetually confused by the world outside their mountain, but the charges told a different story. These weren't isolated incidents. These weren't crimes of passion or momentary lapses in judgment. These were systematic, sustained acts of violence against children committed over years, over decades, with the full knowledge and participation of nearly every adult in the family. The prosecution laid out their case with methodical precision. They called expert witnesses who explained the psychological effects of long-term abuse. They called doctors who had examined the children and found physical evidence of what had been done to them. And they called the children themselves, who once again told their stories to a room full of strangers. Some of the defendants tried to claim ignorance. They said they didn't know it was wrong. They said that's just how things were done in their family. One woman, when asked why she hadn't protected her own children, simply shrugged and said she hadn't known any different. She had been abused as a child. Her mother had been abused. It was just the way things were. The defense tried to paint the Goler family as victims of their own circumstances. They argued that poverty and isolation had created a culture where normal moral boundaries had eroded. They suggested that the defendants themselves had been so damaged by their upbringing that they couldn't be held fully responsible for their actions. But the jury wasn't buying it. Over the course of several trials, nearly all of the defendants were found guilty. The sentences ranged from a few years to over a decade in prison. Some of the older members of the clan died before they could be prosecuted. Others accepted plea deals in exchange for testimony against their relatives. The family that had been so tightly bound together, so united in their silence, began to fracture. Old loyalties dissolved under the pressure of prison time. People who had once protected each other started pointing fingers, trying to save themselves. And through it all, the children watched. Some of them had been placed in foster care. Others had been adopted by families who promised them a different kind of life. But the damage had been done. You don't just walk away from that kind of trauma. You carry it with you. It shapes how you see the world, how you trust people, how you understand your own worth. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have had the courage to break the silence? Or would the weight of generations have kept you quiet, too? When the trials ended and the prison sentences were handed down, most people assumed the story was over. Justice had been served. The children were safe. The system had worked, even if it had taken far too long. But for those who had lived through it, the story was just beginning. The children of the Goler clan were scattered across Nova Scotia, placed in homes where they were expected to simply forget everything that had happened and start over. But trauma doesn't work that way. You can't erase years of abuse with a new address and a fresh start. Many of the children struggled to adapt to normal life. They had never been to school. They didn't know how to interact with other kids their age. Simple things that most children take for granted, like sitting at a dinner table or following a bedtime routine, felt foreign and uncomfortable. They had been raised in chaos, and order felt like a trap. Some of them ran away from their foster homes, drawn back to the mountain, even though there was nothing left there for them. The old shacks had been torn down or abandoned. The adults who remained were either in prison or had scattered to avoid prosecution. But the mountain itself still held a kind of gravity. It was the only home these children had ever known. And no matter how terrible it had been, it was familiar. And familiar, even when it's painful, can feel safer than the unknown. The foster families and social workers did their best, but they were dealing with damage that ran deeper than anyone had anticipated. Several of the children developed serious mental health issues, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. Some turned to drugs or alcohol to numb the memories. A few ended up in trouble with the law themselves, repeating cycles of violence and dysfunction because it was all they had ever known. The system that was supposed to save them had given them a chance, but it couldn't give them back their childhoods. It couldn't undo the years of programming that had taught them they were worthless, that they existed only to be used. And then there were the questions that no one wanted to ask. How many other families were out there living in the same kind of isolation, operating under the same twisted rules? The Goler clan hadn't been unique in their poverty or their remoteness. Across North America, there were countless rural communities where people lived off the grid, where children grew up without ever setting foot in a school, where the outside world was seen as a threat rather than a resource. How many of those communities were hiding their own dark secrets? How many children were suffering in silence because no one was paying attention? The Goler case had been discovered almost by accident because one teacher had noticed something wrong with one child. But what about all the children who never made it to school? What about the families who were even more isolated, even more careful to avoid outside contact? The truth is, we don't know. And that's perhaps the most disturbing part of this whole story. The Goler clan's crimes were eventually exposed and punished, but the systems that allowed those crimes to continue for generations are still in place. Poverty still exists, isolation still exists, and in the spaces where society isn't looking, where it's easier to turn away than to confront uncomfortable truths. There are almost certainly other families living in their own private hells. The children who escaped South Mountain carried their scars into adulthood. Some of them managed to build new lives, to break the cycle that had defined their family for so long. Others weren't so lucky. But all of them knew something that most people never have to learn. That evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it just lives quietly in the woods, passed down from one generation to the next, hidden behind a wall of silence that only breaks when someone finally has the courage to scream. Today, if you drive through the back roads of Nova Scotia near White Rock, you won't find much evidence that the Goler clan ever existed. The shacks on South Mountain have rotted away or been reclaimed by the forest. The family name has faded from public memory, buried beneath decades of other scandals and tragedies. Most of the adults who were convicted have served their time and been released. Some of them still live in Nova Scotia, anonymous and quiet, trying to blend into communities that would rather forget they ever existed. The children, now adults themselves, have scattered across the country. Some have changed their names, desperate to escape the stigma of being a goer. Others have tried to speak out, to tell their stories in hopes that it might prevent something similar from happening to someone else. But their voices rarely reach beyond small circles of activists and social workers who already know how bad things can get. The case did lead to some changes in how child welfare agencies operate. There was increased funding for rural outreach programs, new protocols for investigating isolated families, training for teachers and doctors to recognize signs of severe abuse. But the fundamental problem remains. In a country as vast as Canada, with communities spread across impossible distances, there will always be places where the government's reach doesn't extend. There will always be families who fall through the cracks. And there will always be children who suffer in silence because the adults around them have decided that some secrets are worth keeping. The Goler case forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature. That abuse doesn't just happen in dark alleys or strangers' vans. It happens in homes. It happens in families. And when an entire family structure becomes corrupted, when abuse becomes normalized across generations, the damage spreads like a disease that no one knows how to cure. What happened on South Mountain wasn't an anomaly. It was an extreme example of something that exists in lesser forms all around us. Families that protect their own at the expense of the vulnerable. Communities that turn a blind eye to violence because confronting it would be too uncomfortable, too complicated, too expensive. Systems that fail children over and over again because the people running those systems are overwhelmed, underfunded, or just don't care enough. The children of the Goler clan paid the price for all of those failures. They paid with their innocence, their childhoods, and in some cases, their futures. And while justice was eventually served, while some of the perpetrators did go to prison, the question remains, was it enough? Can any punishment truly account for what was stolen from those children? Can any amount of therapy or support undo the fundamental betrayal of being born into a family that saw you not as a person to be loved and protected, but as an object to be used? The story of the Goler clan isn't just about one family in one remote corner of Canada. It's about what happens when society decides that some people aren't worth watching over. When poverty becomes an excuse for neglect. When isolation becomes permission for abuse. The mountain may be empty now, but the lessons remain. Evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it just lives quietly, generation after generation, waiting for someone to finally notice. And sometimes by the time someone does notice, it's already too late to save everyone. The children who survived carry those mountains inside them now. They carry the weight of a history they never chose. A legacy of pain that was handed down to them like a cursed inheritance. Some of them have found ways to heal. Some of them are still fighting. And some of them never made it out at all. Not really. Even though their bodies left that mountain years ago. This is their story. This is what happened when the world finally looked at something it had been ignoring for far too long. And this is the reminder that somewhere right now there are other mountains, other families, other children waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to care enough to do something about it before it's too late.